And even if we were to stop all other emissions now, we would still overshoot that target. So it's absolutely essential, not only for climate reasons, but also for our health, for our resilience, especially of local communities, for food security, that this happens. We know that it is possible, that actually there are measures now that we can put in place that would immediately reduce 20% of the emissions to meet the Paris Agreement. But currently, climate or public finance is not headed in the right direction. It is not aligned with our climate objectives. So over 600 billion a year is spent on subsidizing agriculture production, and most of that money, 86% or 520 billion, doesn't have any environmental, climate, or health safeguards. So this means that that money is potentially harmful for health and climate. There's no stipulation or regulations on the use of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. And the amount of this harmful public finance is 57 times greater than the amount of climate finance that's going towards food. We know that food systems is cost effective for climate finance community, and it can achieve huge emissions reduction potential. There's an estimation that we need 350 billion a year for resilient and sustainable food systems. So compare that to the 600 billion that is currently spent, or the 520 billion that is potentially harmful, to the 350 billion that we need per year for transforming our food systems. We analyzed the NDCs of 167 countries, and many mention some aspects relevant to food systems, but nearly 3/4 of those NDCs lack any detail on actually what they're doing about food. So this really is a missed opportunity, because if you're not being specific about the measures that you're proposing in the NDCs, you're not going to be able to access the climate finance to implement it. We looked at the NDCs of developing countries, and only 14 billion was declared a need for food systems versus 64 billion for clean energy and transport. So this discussion today really is to highlight, particularly within the aspect of food systems, why we need more investments in agroecology. And so we have a really diverse panel to really bring that, kind of enlighten us on what that means with different examples. So to kick us off, I'd like to turn to Rosinah Mbenya, the country coordinator from PELUM, Kenya, to talk about what is agroecology and food systems, and how has it been implemented in the field from her experience. So Rosinah, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome. I want to start my session by just sharing our experiences from Kenya. I represent a network which is working with over 1 million small-scale farmers in the country. And I want to share the experiences, and I would want to start my presentation or my talking or my session with just welcoming you to work with me in imagining a small farmer in Kenya. And this small-scale farmer is a woman farmer, and is actually a real farmer within the network of PELUM Kenya in one of the counties, Kiambu County. And I will share some of the practices that this farmer has been able to encompass in our own farm, so that she can be able to feed her family, she can be able to adapt and be resilient to these climate changes. And why am I sharing about a small-scale farmer? Because 80% of the farming in Kenya is by smallholder farmers. So this farmer has diversified her livelihood. She is able to have she has different crops in the farm. She's not doing any monoculture, but she has mixed cropping. And this small-scale farmer, again, is also having mixed like livestock, small livestock. And therefore, when times of drought and hard times come, she's not relying on one crop. And originally, this farmer was actually a tea farmer, and they were just doing tea farming alone. But a time came, and they realized that she was becoming more vulnerable, because when one crop fails or one intervention fails, then she's able to be very desperate and not able to have any kind of food throughout the year. This small-scale farmer, again, is able to have her own biological inputs. She's having her own indigenous seeds where she has been able to save throughout the year, and she's ready for each and every season. She's also having her own compost manure. She's also ensuring that our soil is very, very healthy, so that this soil can withstand a lot of challenges that come with difficulties with the changing climate. The same farmer is able to ensure that she's working to ensure that the biodiversity is conserved in her own way, because this farmer is not using harmful chemical inputs. She's able to use the biological inputs which are friendly to the environment, they are friendly to our health, and this farmer is ahead, because I was reading a case of Zimbabwe, and in Zimbabwe they were saying long time ago farmers would use 0 shillings or dollars to be able to cultivate, prepare their land, because they had their own seeds, they could do their own inputs. But now, as we talk, a small-scale farmer in Zimbabwe has to use like $240 per hectare per season to buy seeds, to buy inputs that come with that. But I want to encourage all of us, can we try to push Africa out of that kind of dependency? Because if all the farmers have to actually use that per hectare, it becomes even more difficult, because by the time you buy the seeds, the rainy season is over. By the time you look for money to buy those very difficult inputs, which are actually harmful to the ecosystem, they are washed, they go all the way to the rivers, then it is even more harm. And I know sometimes the climate financing goes to agriculture, but if it can only go to the right agriculture, that is agroecology, then it can make a difference. The same small-scale farmer has agroforestry. She has been able to have different trees in her farm, so that these trees are able to contribute to enhancing the soil cover. They are also trying to regulate the climate, and also more benefits, even aesthetic benefits. And the same farmer is also recycling a lot of her own inputs from the farm and ensuring there is 0 waste. So my question and my challenge to all of you, can't we make the small-scale farmers in Africa to be like this case of a farmer in Kiambu County in Kenya? And why am I saying that? Because these are the farmers that feed us, and with the COVID times, we realized that the local markets were even more relevant. And this local market I'm talking about, because the same farmer is growing a lot of traditional foods, indigenous foods that can only be related with the particular area that farmer is coming. I know we have diverse cultures, we have diverse indigenous foods. It's only agroecological farmers who are able to come up with this kind of indigenous foods that enhance our heritage as Africans. While this is a case of a farmer within the network, I want to share that most of the older farmers in the network of PELUM Kenya are doing the same, and they have been able to withstand the changes of climate change, including having water harvesting and conservation. They are not wasting water. They are able to conserve the water through cover cropping, like conservation agriculture, ensuring there is also storage of water. And this is what every farmer in Kenya wants. Every farmer wants to be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and able to withstand this changing climate. While this is so, as introduced here, I also note globally that there is the challenge of climate financing, particularly in our country, because most of the climate finances, yes, it goes to other sectors. Yet, from my understanding, is climate has to be thought in a multi-stakeholder perspective, whereby the sector of agriculture, the sector of energy, the sector of forestry, the sectors that relate to the smallholder farmer has to be taken into aspect. And not only agriculture that is needed, but also basically agroecology, because you may be investing in agriculture, yet the same agriculture is contributing to greenhouse emissions because of the fossil fuels and the harmful inputs that are used. So if we have to support the farmers, if we have to support the communities to adapt, it must be through agroecological approaches. And also in terms of the policies, we need more action in terms of favorable policies, favorable programs that are able to support the smallholder farmers, so that they can still do more, that they can still be able to be able to support themselves in terms of climate adaptation and resilience. We have a lot of rising issues, climatic drought, the fall armyworms that are making the farmers more vulnerable. So for me, I'll be happy to hear what the panelists is contributing, but particularly looking at the issues of climate financing towards the African smallholder farmers and making the farmers to continue practicing the agroecology for their own resilience and for them to be self-reliant even in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosinah. It's so important to hear your perspective in the context of the political discussions and the announcements that have been taking place over the last week, that there's an acknowledgement of, yes, climate finance for food systems, but in the context, oftentimes, food security and resilience is interpreted quite differently from what you've just explained, right? So right now it's thinking about, well, we need to ensure more access to external inputs rather than creating more independence and less dependency on these inputs so that farmers can be more resilient without this kind of lock-in effect to industrial agriculture processes. So I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. So over here we have Bridget Mugambe, Program Coordinator for the African Food Sovereignty Alliance. We have Dale Lewis, CEO and founder of COMACO Zambia, or Community Markets for Conservation. And we have Jahan Chowdhury, Cluster Lead for Environment and Climate at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. And we also had a panel, Honorable Kaaya Christine, who is a member of parliament from Uganda, but as is the risk of inviting a government official, she had to deal with delegation emergency, so she's unable to join us. But I think we will have a lot of expertise, knowledge that we can draw on from our existing panel. So I first like to ask the first question to Bridget. Maybe to we heard the experience from Rosinah on Kenya. From Uganda. So Uganda recently put out a more ambitious, nationally determined contribution, a climate action plan. And can you give a bit more context on what Uganda is facing and what drove this kind of shift and this ambition with agroecology?
Thank you, Patty, for that question. I really miss our legislator. Now I see how questions are coming to me, but that is very fine. Yes, maybe to give it a bit of context, like I've been introduced, I work with the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, and what we have been doing as AFSA for the past, since 2019, we launched a campaign in 12 African countries to integrate agroecology into climate policies. And one of the countries where we have been working, spearheaded by our member PELUM Uganda, is Uganda. So it is within that context that we have been following and pursuing the process of development of the National Adaptation Plan, but also the NDC, the Uganda NDC. And I should say the process has been quite taxing. One, because agroecology is not appreciated in the sense that it should be. It's just taken as a set of practices that are not modernized and a lot of other misconceptions. So we've had challenges and interventions around trying to help our technocrats and policymakers understand agroecology, but also at the same time intervene in the process of developing the NDC. So as part of the NDC, Uganda developed an implementation plan. It has, I wouldn't say integrated, but it has included agroecology in the NDC. There is still a lot that needs to be done, and I think because of the civil society pressure, they included agroecology there, as part of the NDC, but it has to be expounded. In terms of the detail of the NDC, it really needs a lot of work. But we appreciate that at least that is a first step that Uganda took.
So when you refer to civil society pressure, I'm going to follow up and ask you about AFSA's role, because I think AFSA has played a pretty significant role in shaping Uganda's NDC. So tell me a bit more about what AFSA broadly, what does it stand for, what is it advocating for?
Yes, AFSA's role, as the name says, we are an alliance, and in all this, one, we are doing a number of things. We are doing the research, because when AFSA was started, we recognized that a lot of African work was based on research from the West, if I may say. So one of our strategies to do our own research as Africans, but also to build our own capacity to be able to, one, not just support production, but also participate in policy spaces like this, and be able to interact with our negotiators and policy makers. Most critical is also around movement building. So we are building a movement not just of practitioners, but also advocates for agroecology, to be able to spread the word around agroecology, to be able to help our technocrats understand what we mean by agroecology. In terms of this climate space, we have worked really closely with the African group of negotiators, specifically on agriculture, also on gender and land, to integrate issues of agroecology. So that is what we've really been doing in this climate space. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Next, I'm going to turn to Dale. You are based in Zambia, so tell me a bit about the situation in Zambia. And you also came from a background in conservation. So tell us, given the context that you witnessed when you first moved to Zambia, you said 40 years ago, right? So you've been there for 40 years, a really long time. What are the changes? What did you see when you first arrived there? What are the changes you've been seeing now about the thinking and the approach to conservation, environment, climate change? And your COMACO is really invested in agroecology as a result. So how are you bringing all these aspects together?
Well, thank you. I was very fortunate to have really a front row seat to be able to live alongside communities that were desperately poor and living alongside incredible biodiversity, and what they would often be forced to do, not out of their own desire, but to do great damage to their own natural resources. And it really perplexed me, because there was so much money being spent by donors and government and even private sector to try to address rural poverty. But really the problems were not being solved. And I think just out of personal passion for having an opportunity to be able to be close to this problem, be able to study it, and having somewhat of an academic background, it seemed to me that poor people really live right on a razor's edge of going downhill very quickly if they miss their harvest, because there is nothing to fall back on. And the consequence of that is more environmental damage. Why does it have to be that way? And yet there's so much money being thrown around. And so, is there an answer? And if you look around, you would wonder, well, we've had a very long struggle to make an answer actually happen by doing something that I don't think donors have to do, and I don't think your typical private sector has the energy or the resources to do. And we were not motivated for profit. We were motivated for change, real change, to affect change. And that happened when we made a deal to a relatively small group of farmers, where we would offer them an opportunity to make considerably more money if they would change their farming practices, if they would put down their firearms, if they would put away their snares. It's a very long story, so I'm going to abbreviate it by saying that since then we have become a company of over 500,000 farmers manufacturing 23 different food products that come exclusively from those farmers that really could not see a way out of poverty. Incomes have more than quadrupled. We put World Food Program pretty much out of business. We don't need food relief anymore. And the system is so much based on agroecology with agroforestry. Farmers never will have to go back to fertilizer. Maybe I could stop there, or if you'd like me to continue a little bit more, I'd be happy to.
I just want to emphasize that when you came in 40 years ago, you came in as an elephant biologist, and you're supposed to be studying elephants, but instead you were distracted by the sounds of gunfire, of poaching of elephants, and that is what turned you to look at, well, what is the cause of that? What are the what's driving the poaching, and over time, kind of trying to figure out and working with local communities. I want you to tell your story, but I'm going to tell it for you to everyone because I think it's so important to really understand the kind of the situation at that time and what you're trying to help address through your story.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of problems that governments generally work in silos, and you'll have a National Parks and Wildlife Service that just does law enforcement. The Forestry Department, focuses on protecting the forest. Agriculture has a history of a certain kind of farming approach that they've learned from years ago, that fertilizer is the answer. And it goes on and on and on, and nothing seems to change. And this is where I challenge science, and I challenge the private sector to sort of disrupt this traditional way of thinking, because there is a very willing population of small-scale farmers that need help. And when you connect with them and begin to turn their life around, you find that they are so willing to take on new ideas and experiences because they've gotten over that initial problem of hunger, and they can think about the future. And I think, look, I don't have a background in agriculture. I really don't. It's not that complicated. Nature does most of the work. You can pick this up, and I haven't come up with an original idea in my life, I don't think. Yeah, I get these ideas from other people, but you package it and target it, and there's a very willing population of small-scale farmers, certainly in Zambia. 80% of the farmers in Zambia are small-scale. A huge opportunity for the private sector. We're exporting to South Africa right now. We're exporting to the UK. I mean, these were farmers 20 years ago that couldn't even feed themselves. So this is something that I think has an enormous opportunity to bring together people like yourselves who really have studied a lot of the things that we haven't studied and build these relationships. I think that's why we're here, really, to begin to see how we can create something very powerful for the planet. And I would invite all of you to come to Zambia and let me show you what we're doing, and share every lesson I can to help you with your work as well.
Thank you, Dale. Jahan, I'm going to turn to you next. So you represent a public financial institution focused on the agricultural sector, and recently IFAD produced a stock report that found that approximately 13% of the projects sampled in your study apply the principles of agroecology in their entirety, and that another 40% applied some aspect of agroecological principles. And it also showed that 96% of the projects positively contribute to IFAD's priority area on climate change, while only 18% of the non-agroecological projects do so. So maybe if you can expand a bit more, how is IFAD, reflecting on this, but more importantly, how, in terms of its future ongoing strategy. And I know you come more from a finance background, so maybe if you can also expand a bit more on what are the challenges from a kind of Ministry of Finance perspective in terms of investing in agriculture. Why is it so hard?
I would definitely want to come to Zambia, but not for work, for vacation after this COP. But thank you for the invite. Food. I'm super hungry. I'm sure you are too. when it comes to food, when you go back home tonight, you will be wasting 1/3 of your food. Me too, probably. 1/3 of the emission is going to come from that food that you eat tonight, and 1/3 of the food would be produced by smallholder farmers. So that 1/3 number is super important. You mentioned about 300 billion. Now, that may sound like a large number, but it's really not. Do you know how much money you have spent on Apple products up until September of this year? 9 months? We have, as consumers, spent $396 billion on Apple products. So compare that number with the number that you need to convert the food systems into green system. From IFAD's point of view, we see food system from a nexus perspective. Within food systems, we see food security. Within food system, we see nutrition. And within food system, we see climate change. So that is our programmatic approach when it comes to food systems. That's one. When we think about food systems, it is not just about the production. It's also about distribution, storage, transportation, marketing. So the entire value chain. When we think about food systems, it's not necessarily just the smallholder farmers. Of course, they are super important, and it's important for us to reach the last mile. But we also need to think about other players in the entire value chain, including the private sector. So that's how we are trying to approach the food systems. You mentioned the numbers, and the numbers are not striking numbers. And the reason the numbers from IFAD side is not necessarily so striking at this stage is because the sample size that we had taken, we were only focusing on those projects that were supposed to be implemented from 2017 till 2021. Few things had happened since the numbers came on board. First one is we actually increased our overall climate finance target when it comes to our loan and grant program. So before it was 25%, now we are saying 40% of all our loan and grant must focus on climate. And this is not about climate mainstreaming. This is to demonstrate additional benefits from climate-related investment. 90% of our climate finance is actually focused on adaptation, which is also very relevant to the food systems. So there has been some changes since those numbers came up a couple of years ago. Now, we provide loans to the government. For us, it is very important that the government owns this loan based on the plan and strategy that they have. And if they do not reflect food systems in their NDCs, then it will be us imposing something on them, and we don't want that. So it's very critical. It's critical that when it comes to the NDCs and the national adaptation plans, food systems get properly reflected. That's one. The second is, for Ministry of Finance side, they have limited revenue. It's a catch-22 situation. You have very limited fiscal space. On the other hand, you are being pushed to raise your level of ambition when it comes to climate. That includes food systems as well. Now, the plan, therefore, does not necessarily align with the fiscal room that the government has. So we need to be more realistic in terms of ensuring that the priorities are reflected and those priorities are properly costed by the Finance Ministry and also the Line Ministry. Food system cannot be addressed just by Ministry of Agriculture. It's a cross-cutting issue. It requires interventions from various different ministries. And having NDCs and food system reflected in NDC is not going to cut it. We need to ensure that those are then translated to sectoral strategy, sectoral budget. The third important part is to ensure that there's actually a business case. Yeah? We need to ensure that there is a return that the government can consider. Otherwise, it's very difficult for them to invest when it comes to something that wouldn't necessarily get them the return that they need in order to expand their fiscal space. And there are business cases behind food systems. We can come up with some very specific examples, but I'll leave that for another discussion on perhaps later. And finally, it's very important for us to think about indicators against the food systems. If we do not know how to measure, we will never be able to know how to manage. And if the indicators are not there, we wouldn't be able to demonstrate the results. And if we cannot demonstrate the results, we will never be able to mobilize resources. So in terms of planning, let's make sure food systems is properly reflected in the NDC. Let's make sure that we are properly costing NDC. Let's make sure that there's a proper investment case and co-benefits that comes out of food system investment. And let's make sure that we can measure. And if these criteria are there, it's easier for multilateral institutions like us to invest because it is coming directly from the government side and it is being demanded directly by the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Jahan. And I just want to reflect that it is important to cost out and make the business case, but it's not just the economic costs, right? We have to look at the impacts on health, impacts on kind of society, environmental impacts, and oftentimes those are externalities that are not integrated in. So that is a big challenge for us, but we can dig into that in another round of questions. I want to turn back first to Bridget. You raised agroecology as a key solution to climate change, but we've said that it's been significantly underfunded. So what kinds of projects are you seeing being funded right now? And instead, what should be funded? So, we've heard different cases about agroecology, but maybe you can kind of, from an AFSA perspective, go into a bit more detail about what you're advocating for.
Yeah, thank you, Patty. I was also just reflecting on what Jahan has just shared on what IFAD is doing. And I could just see as a government official, if I were a government official, I would just be sitting down and ticking the box, does it have food systems tick? Does it have co-benefits tick? Is it costed tick? But I think for us as AFSA, as agroecology practitioners, as people who advocate for agroecology, we would go beyond, that ticking. We would go beyond that ticking. And the evaluation, of course, would need the indicators, but would have to raise the question of, who is benefiting from this funding? When you give a loan, it's not as easy to make people accountable as when you give a grant. So that was all going through my mind. And to get back to your question, what we see, of course, from national governments is what is funded is what is prioritized. Agroecology is not prioritized, I could say, in most of our governments. Agriculture alone is getting very little funding. There could be about 4 or 5 African countries that get up to 10%, of their national budget to agriculture, then let alone agroecology. It is almost nowhere under funding. If you go to any meeting where there are small-scale farmers, the first question they will ask is, where is the finance? We need funding. And we know those are the people that are really central to agroecology. So we do not see that funding. Maybe it's coming through governments and through government plans, which are mainly pushing for, the industrial model of funding, which is looking at large-scale farms, turning land into monocultures, tree planting. So that is the climate financing we are doing, and not indigenous species of trees, but new foreign species that are not doing so well. So we do not see the funding of agroecology. I cannot put a percent to it because it's almost, non-existent in most of our government plans and programs. Yeah.
Thank you, Bridget. Dale, let me turn to you from your own lived experience and also the challenge you face in financing. What has been critical to the success of your initiative to make it viable? And what is needed further to kind of further scale and grow these types of projects? Not even just your own, but just similar types of enterprises.
Well, let's not kid ourselves. There is a lot of waste in the way money is spent in the developing world. I don't know if you would agree with me, but certainly I have seen a lot of waste. And when I became a company, or we became a company, something very important happened in the way we think about cost effectiveness and results. In a company, you either succeed or you fail. And when it comes to a model where your success depends on small-scale farmers, you really have to help them become part of your brand. And that brand has to be something special. And when you're very committed to conservation, and you know the answer is from the small-scale farmers, then what an exciting opportunity to show that a company, if you really work hard, manage your money very carefully, do your marketing, do your staff hiring, do everything smart, and bring those farmers into your company, you suddenly realize you have a really interesting kind of business that can attract finance. And I think this is what I've learned, Patty, is that people who have money want to see something that's going to have an impact. And it's something about a private sector that I've learned is that you have to be honest. If you're not honest, you're not going to run a business for very long. And if your model, and if your brand, our brand is called It's Wild. And not surprisingly, on every package that we sell, there's a picture of an elephant head, which is very symbolic of where it all started, from all those poached elephants. And by the way, we don't find many poached elephants anymore. So that's another really good story. But the brand is not the brand for anyone else but those farmers who made it happen. And so we're evolving a company that is becoming a model, at least in Zambia. The government is being very open-minded to what we're achieving. And they're even helping us with grants, because we're seeing a business that's actually taking care of poor people and the environment. So I'm going on a little bit too long, I realize, but the point I want to make is that conservation really can be a successful business enterprise, because we do produce food that's chemical free. It is achieving things that customers, when they swipe the QR code and they look at our website and see what really is behind the brand, they buy the product. And look, donors are not going to stay with you for very long, but if you've got a good product, customers will. You just got to stay with it, stick with it, get the volumes, get the sales, and keep those farmers very committed to those practices that we all believe in, regenerative farming, because that is the future, I think, for farming in Africa.
Thank you, Dale. Jahan, Bridget responded to your previous comments about the business case and also where the financing is actually going to. IFAD works directly with governments, but the issue is, how do you make sure that the financing is actually getting to the people who need it, especially to the small-scale farmers? What do you see as a challenge, and what are what can be done in terms of really making sure that those who need access to it can get access to it?
Let me talk about not necessarily what can be done, but what we are doing. So IFAD does provide sovereign loan, but we also provide non-sovereign loans. So, for example, national public development banks, agricultural banks, other private sector entities. I'll give you two examples. One is we are focusing on 4 East Africa and 4 South African countries where we have designed a financial structure whereby we and GCF, we are taking the first loss and the second loss, working with Equity Bank as well as Standard Bank, who are taking the second loss. And then we are topping it up with private sector's own senior debt. The beauty of that is that we are front-loading our investment to offtake the risk that the private sector face. And eventually, these private sector entities are going to be providing resilient seeds, access to technology, access to finance to the smallholder farmers through farmers' organizations. Why farmers' organizations? Because it's very difficult to reach out to every single smallholder farmer. So if you can aggregate through farmers' organization, then it's easier for you to do this kind of transactions. So the element of blending with the private sector, where we both have stake, is important to reach the last mile. The other example is where we are actually providing grant resources as well as concessional loan to public development banks. Concessional loan in order to expand its capital so they can in turn provide greater, higher access to financing to smallholder farmers. Without that injection of capital, they wouldn't have been able to reach the wider communities. But we are blending this with grant because we realize that we also need to do financial innovation. We need to ensure that the state banks, national development banks, have the ability to design and deploy new financial instruments. And that could only happen if we can provide the grant. So there is an innovation component, and then there is a on-lending financing component. Why are we doing this? The answer is very simple. Oftentimes, we disproportionately focus on external financing, disproportionately focus on financing that we think will come from the development partners or international private sector entities. But there's a lot of liquidity in these national development banks. There is a lot of private sector players in these national boundaries. So if the right actors are there, why can't we build the capacity of those right actors within the boundary of the national entities, governments, and provide them with blended financing instruments that would in turn help them to reach to the poorest of the poor? Thanks.
Thank you, Jahan. Bridget, I'd like you to kind of respond to Jahan. He talked about the need for the right actors to be there in designing financial instruments and in co-designing the implementation, the program. So who needs to be there? He talked about especially the financial actors, but from your perspective, who else needs to be there?
Well, I think from what Jahan shared, one issue he raised is that, of course, as a financial institution, they cannot get to each and every small-scale farmer. So they will go through farmer organizations. And, well, in the ideal world, I think farm organizations really should be in that space to, one, not just design the instruments, but also be able to feed the institutions with that, what kind of finance is needed and for what exact purpose. So of course, farm organizations should be in that space, but they should also be able to determine that kind of finance that is needed. And based on what we see happening right now, definitely farmers are not in that space. Even civil society organizations that work with farmers are not in that space. That is largely space that is left to financial institutions like banks. They're the ones that are within the spaces of designing financial frameworks. And then also, many African countries do not have agricultural banks. So even when the finances come to the banks, they're not easily accessible because the lending rates are not favorable to the farmers. Taking first loss, second loss, I don't know, maybe Jahan could share with us how that is working and in which countries it's working. because at least for Uganda, I do not think that is working, but if you could share with us that kind of information, I think that would really be helpful. I think for me, what is happening with financial institutions is that they're at a certain level here where they connect with governments, and a few I could call, if they are there, farmer organizations that, they are working with to come up with all these financial frameworks. So for me, it would really be good to know which countries this is working, the first loss, second loss, institutions, and how well that is working, because it would really be very good for our farmers. Also, the issue of lending rates, or for farmers, it's not there. Most agricultural credit facilities are not really working for farmers. So for me, it sounds really ideal. How well it's working, I am not really very sure on that.
Jahan, you want to go in with a few examples?
Back and forth, like it. The idea is to do credit enhancement, all right? And you have multiple instruments that you can use in order to enhance that credit. If you, for example, go to Rwanda, we have been working in Rwanda focusing on guarantee, solar guarantee, for example, yeah? So you are deploying guarantee instruments in order to encourage the private sector entities to invest on a sector that they're not necessarily very familiar with. We often conduct, for example, pre-feasibility, feasibility study that private sector entities or some of the government entities are not necessarily interested to do because they wouldn't know what would be the outcome. So why would I spend $300,000, $500,000 on pre-feasibility, feasibility study in order to demonstrate whether there is actually a market? But again, we are off taking that risk. In Brazil, for example, we have a first loss facility for biodigesters. Yeah, so very specific product, very specific instrument aligned to that product. We are working on solar securitization, so pooling various different debt into a specific asset class and then selling it to the investors who are willing to take the risk on tranches. So there are instruments out there, but IFAD is only just one organization, and we only have limited resources. Our portfolio is approximately $7 billion, but that is over 3 years' time. And there is a point that whether there is interest from the government side to take loan, at the end of the day, we are in the business of actually giving loan, not grant. Grant is only just 10% of what we do. And if the government is not necessarily interested, then it's very difficult for us to deploy loan. And we want to make sure that the debt that the government is incurring, even though it's concessional, is owned, managed by the government. So if IFAD is not implementing anything, we just hand over the loan to the government. Government then establishes the project management unit, and they are the ones who would eventually be managing the projects. So I would say that we need to make sure that there are many more players involved in this space in order to create the collective impact that we need to move to that 1.5 degree goal. Single institutions on their own will never be able to deliver what we have planned for, that is 1.5 degree.
Thank you, Jahan. Rosinah, I want to bring you back into the conversation. You've been listening intently to this kind of discussion going back and forth, and maybe if you can comment specifically on government leadership. Jahan was saying governments need to be willing to weigh in, and from your perspective in Kenya, what are you seeing and how do you see the importance of government leadership?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to just also first start with from where Jahan has talked about the funding. I think in Kenya we still have the same funding challenges in terms of where the funding goes. And I know they have been having so many complicated kinds of analogies and ideologies on where climate financing goes, and I've had so many concept about like carbon trading, but from where I sit, I've never seen a single farmer or a single person, a grassroots indigenous person who has, for example, changed his livelihood or their livelihood from such a scheme. I've also had a lot of smart initiatives, hybrid seeds, but also from the perspective I sit, I've also not seen any farmer who has been sustainably benefited or are happy about such ideologies. And I think the farmers that, or even the indigenous communities that are there, they want a space whereby even before such schemes are introduced, maybe there needs to be a lot of maybe consultation and finding what is relevant and context specific, because maybe as Africa continent where we are hard hit by the changes of climate, we have different priorities and different aspects that we would really love to see on the ground. And also talking about the funding, I think farmers or some indigenous groups scare away from, let's say, loans and so complicated systems, because farmers don't want to just enter into systems, then all of a sudden you're not sure what you're signing into, and all of a sudden your cows are taken and all this. So it becomes very difficult. And if these financing schemes have to continue, maybe we need to go back to the grassroots and really understand what are the needs and the situations that really want to farmers or communities really want. And also just briefly about the NDCs, I think the space need also to be increased, and even looking at the policies that have been there before we go to the indicators. What is being done? What we can't have indicators which have, I believe the planning must start from the inputs. What is the input before we can even put the indicators and measure change? What has been put into place, so that we can say after 10 years with this kind of input, then this is the change, because these goals have been set, but they are far away from reality, and a lot has really to be done. And as my friend said from Zambia, farmers are willing and ready to adopt schemes which make them self-reliant, not schemes that maybe the question continues to be who is benefiting. So it needs to be indigenous communities if the schemes have to work.
Thank you, Rosinah. I want to turn back to Zambia over here because Dale, Rosinah, you said, at least from your perspective, what you've seen is that the farmers that you've been working with have not benefited from carbon farming. But Dale and I had a conversation earlier today where you said actually carbon markets have been really important for your farmers that you've been working with. And when we talked about it's sometimes a quite contentious issue. So I want to drill in deeper to the context that you've been facing. What has made it work in your perspective? How are your farmers benefiting, and how is it structured?
Well, keep in mind that the transaction should be with the farmer, directly with the farmer, that is not only being paid for the crop, but being paid for the way they're growing the crop. That's a very important point, at least with our company, that we don't buy crops from just any farmer. We buy crops from farmers that are actually complying with those eco-agricultural, agroforestry practices. That is just, I think, fundamental. And I'm sorry, your question, I got a little bit off track. Bring me back to earth.
How is the carbon market benefiting the farmers you're working with?
Right. So as a company, we realized that given the difficulty of going across very difficult terrain with our trucks to buy the crops, all of the different costs that you incur as a private sector entity, for which my friend over here probably wouldn't give me money because it's way too much risk. So we have to take that risk. But if you believe in your farmers, they actually do something quite magical. They actually do put carbon back in the soil. And when you have a certain farming practice that keeps them farming the same plot year after year after year because they are keeping the soil healthy, something very important happens. They become sedentary. When you're sedentary, you don't have to shift and clear more forest, right? And if you are doing that, that means you're saving the local forest because you're not cutting the trees down as much. That gives us another source of income, and that has been our real source of finance. We have not gone to commercial banks. They are not that interested in the welfare of that small individual farmer unless they can make money off of them, frankly. And so somebody has to think about how are we going to make a business accountable to the environment. And again, I go back, the marketplace. You've got to create a product. On the one hand, a food product that's produced in a sustainable way in which we use trees to keep the soils fertile, called agroforestry. So those products combined with another product of carbon, you put those two income streams together, then you've got a viable business. And that's really been our story. And incidentally, it's been a real turnaround for our company that we call COMACO. And it's only because it is becoming more lucrative, credible, that we're actually getting interest from sources of finance. What worries me is how long it's taken and how many trees have we lost? How many animals could we have lost because it's taken so long? And so I would encourage every one of us to think about how we can make this happen more quickly and learn from models that could make it work more effectively, cost effectively, so that we can attract an IFAD to say, look, here is a model that actually does make sense. It's not your conventional model. Can I ask IFAD to take a little bit of risk like we did and try something a little bit out of the ordinary, park some of your money with us because we have handled a lot of debt, but at rates that are way too high. So interesting where we're going. Let's check in next year and see where we are. Hopefully we haven't gone bankrupt. I think we'll be okay.
Can I dig a little bit deeper? So some of the concerns by those who kind of raise issues about carbon markets are issues of land grabbing, land tenure, kind of whether kind of the financialization in this aspect creates that risk. What do you see? Do you see that as a risk with the farmers you're working with?
Very good question. The understanding of soil, the promises that we've made, the COMACO promises, we will make conservation profitable, but you, the small-scale farmer, you must do the conservation. And we have been faithful to that promise year after year after year until they've seen themselves prosper. They've got 3 meals every day. They don't have to worry about tomorrow. Would you break a promise? You know, would you go against the partner that's been honest broker for you to find opportunities? No. These are people that you would trust with your life. I say that literally. And so I think if we say, no, don't greenwash, don't overexploit for the short-term gains that you might think you would get from some other carbon dealer that's not there for the right reasons, they are COMACO. I will tell you that on our board, we're an indigenous company, domiciled completely in Zambia. We're a nonprofit, social enterprise. And to be able to convince the communities that we have nothing to hide, we invited them to select somebody from the community that we work, over 105 chieftains, to pick one person who will represent all of them on our board. So every quarter we have a board meeting, and all the other people there are all with nice suit and tie and degrees and everything, but on that board is someone from the community who now has a WhatsApp and can report back to the community who we are. that's the trust that I think might make us credible as a long-term partner with the communities and hopefully be able to grow more farmers along the way.
So you're saying the secret ingredient is trust?
Very
and-
much.
And this transparency and engagement, so they're part of the whole governance in deciding, you know, the kind of, I guess if it's, they're on your board, kind of the strategy and the kind of the oversight of COMACO.
Well, we have to because they are the story. If we market, what are we going to market? We don't do COMACO. The farmer does all of the work. Like we said, we will make conservation profitable. So if we want to ask you to buy our product, you've really got to believe that what we're saying is true, and whether we're going to be audited or we'll be visited by the press or whoever one day will come and do a detailed case study on who we are and what we've actually achieved. We want to gain that trust, not just with the farmer, but gain that trust with the consumer. So that relationship is where I think we see growth. And with growth, we find money from IFAD and other sources so that we can build a broader based market for conservation.
Thank you, Dale. Now I want to open up to the audience. If you have questions, is there a roaming mic, or how do we get questions from the audience? How's that going to work? Great. Someone has his hand over there. Up.
Hi, thank you guys. That was a really great panel. My name is Nidal. I'm coming from Palestine. I'm working for the Heinrich Böll Foundation. We have been heavily involved with the agroecology movement, food sovereignty movement in Palestine and in Jordan. And we're seeing that a lot of the techniques that, first of all, I have to say, it's really inspiring. It's such a growing movement, and I think it's spreading like wildfire everywhere. We're seeing amazing farms, agroecology farms that are going back to traditional agricultural knowledge, using local seeds and even reviving seeds that we almost lost to GMOs. They're achieving food sovereignty in a difficult political context that we did not imagine was possible. And it was all there. It was all local resources, all local inputs, no chemicals, no fertilizers. And we're proving, these model farms are proving that it is cost efficient without any intrusion. So it's really wonderful. I take the opportunity, since I know all of you are heavily invested in this topic, to look up on YouTube just a short movie. It's called Hidden Revolution or Untold Revolution, Food Sovereignty in Palestine, just to get an idea about this movement. So my question, so I can give the chance to others, is when it comes to finance, I was curious, and from your introduction as well, I'm curious where you think any form of finance, climate finance, could go to agroecology, because like I said, I think it needs more governmental conviction that agroecology is self-sufficient. Farmers need to be convinced that monoculture and chemical mass farming is not the way forward, because they're indebted by all the costs of chemicals that come with these seeds and use. So this is what's putting them under. So if we're talking about climate finance, I can see it for loss and damage perhaps, but where else do you see it going? Because I think if this idea of agroecology and food sovereignty is adopted, it can be done without anyone coming in to finance it, because we've been facing also that some funding is coming and the movement is saying, no, we want agency over our movement. We don't want someone to come fund us to do this. We can do it ourselves. So this is my question. What you envision for this kind of climate financing? Yeah.
Does anyone on the panel want to take this question? If we're asking for more climate finance and it should go to agroecology, what does that mean?
May I? Why does it have to be climate finance? It can be development finance. I think it's very important to kind of, again, demonstrate the co-benefit that climate is not just climate, but it does bring development benefit as well. And I think that's where there are a lot of opportunities out there that think beyond the multilateral climate funds, think beyond the multilateral or bilateral climate financing opportunities, and try to integrate this with the development finance. From IFAD side, we are also thinking about a new asset class. So as he was mentioning about carbon credit, what we are thinking is, can we imagine a world where we can have resilience credit? What we are essentially trying to do is quantify the benefits of resilience and capture that quantification in form of a price in credit. So if the farmers are improving the resilience through agroecology in a community, and I'm talking about hundreds and thousands of smallholder farmers because we need the volume and scale to make this work, if they are improving the overall resilience of a community as a whole, then there should be some incentive for them. And that incentive can come in form of carbon credit that could be priced, that could be traded, that could be owned by the smallholder farmers, which means that they can diversify their income as well, and they will have more empowerment. The question then would be, and that could be a source of financing as well, the question for you would be, why would anybody want to buy this credit? Well, I can tell you the private sector would want to buy this credit because eventually what these smallholder farmers are doing is avoiding the loss. It's protecting the investment from the private sector as well as from the government from future shocks. So if you're improving your resilience, you are essentially protecting the assets of the government, private sector, and also for your assets as well from future shocks. So that's one reason. The second reason would be, I'm actually continuing with my current credit rating. If you have more exposure to shocks, then your credit rating goes down, whether we are talking about individual organizations or sovereign government. By improving the overall resilience, you're maintaining your current credit rating, or perhaps you're even improving. And third reason, and I'll stop here, is the overall social benefits that such resilience credit can bring to the community as a whole. So we need to think about development finance, but we can also think about other ways of attracting finance.
Thank you, Jahan. Does anyone else have a comment on this question? Rosinah?
I just wanted to talk about the issue of what exactly in financing. For me, I would look at what in Africa, what is the percentage of farmers, what are they doing? And these are smallholder farmers. These smallholder farmers, they are doing what they are doing for their own livelihoods, for their own sustainability, for their own indigenous identity. Actually, in Africa, we love our culture, we love our indigenous. And I would see that the climate financing should go to supporting such a big sector like agriculture, which is like a mainstay of economy to most of African countries. And while at the same time supporting, it is not just any agriculture, because we know some of these agriculture, even if they are not benefiting the climate, they are increasing the temperatures, so on. So it has to be in agroecology. I know the carbon markets, I think there's a lot of, I mean, people don't, the farmer down there, they are not comfortable with the schemes which are not very clear, and which for a long time, because since the time the carbon credits were introduced with the forest sector, the farmers also tried, and in Kenya it has been a case of failure. So unless it is now proven to work, it would be another difficult thing of whereby it will even make the agroecology sector go back, because farmer will not want to be associated with something that maybe they tried in the forestry and it didn't work. So the schemes that Working for Africa is where farmers are really able to be their own resilient, they are able to sustain and have shorter value chain, because also in Africa we have seen where by foods are being exported, agriculture needs to be well understood, because you export food all the way to a very long distance, you continue to emit because of the travel distances. So we want communities who are able to produce food in an agroecological way, and that in a way is already a benefit, a business case, because it looks at the health of the environment. It's not just profits, but looking how have we contributed to declining health cases, how have we contributed to a cleaner environment and building a better business case that is not just based on the market, what is happening in the market, but a whole and ecosystem or integrated approach.
Yeah, I think for me, my simple response to the question from the colleague from Palestine, where do we see more funding coming from? We need to defund industrial agriculture. Just see all the money that is going to chemical inputs, that is going to, hybrid seeds, GMO research. Put that money in agroecology, You've shared a case in Palestine, how it is thriving, even with very little financing. So imagine what would happen if agroecology had the fund that it needs to thrive. Look at all the funds that are going into green revolution, approaches and technologies. Put that money to agroecology. We need to fund agroecology if it's going to thrive. That's what I can say.
Thank you, Bridget. I think we have time for one more question. Oh my goodness. Okay, we're going to take two questions. Wait, there's one there, and then we're going to ask the panel to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to speak in English, but to be clear, express myself clearly, I will speak in French. So she will translate that. Thank you. Ok. Merci. Tout à l'heure, il a parlé de garantie. Le secteur privé a besoin de garanties pour accompagner le financement. Ma question est, de quelle garantie dont a besoin le secteur privé quand on sait que nous sommes dans une crise climatique, que s'il aujourd'hui n'accompagne pas, ou demain nous tous on payera. Voilà la réalité. Est-ce que demain, si le monde qui est aujourd'hui menacé par la crise climatique n'existe pas, est-ce que le secteur privé peut toujours faire des profits? Voilà ma question.
Thanks. That was a really good and challenging question, so I'll try to do it justice. The question was about the private sector and how there was a mention earlier that the private sector needs guarantees to be able to get finance. But in a situation of climate crisis, can those guarantees be ensured, and what would you need, or what would the private sector need to do to be able to ensure that there is that financing?
Okay, we're going to take a round of questions, so just remember that question. There's one back there.
Thank you very much, respected panelists and everyone for the wonderful discussion. This is Prayas from Nepal. We, Digo Vikas Institute, are here. We currently work with the local farmers, with the small and peasants, knowing and identifying their indigenous technologies, local innovations, which are resilient to climate crisis and catastrophes as well. I do agree with Jahan as well. That means that he indicated the systems needs indicators, measures, and documentations which need to be demonstrated for its longevity. As well, agriculture is the foremost for the food production, rather for the business purpose on a foremost basis. But if we observe the current scenario, only large-scale commercial farmers are recognized as farmers, and the small peasants are recognized mostly as a poor farmers, or let's say just a subsistence farmer. But if we observe the data, more than 70% of world food has been contributed by small and peasants farmer. And directing this financing system, Jahan has also mentioned that this need to be towards capacitating the actors, major actors, connecting with the farming community, capacitating the farmers, and ultimately connecting them with the chain, the value chain of production system. So in Nepal as well, we are trying to do the same. We are trying to promote the indigenous knowledge and technologies as well as indigenous food system of local and small farmers and peasants. But some challenges are there, like as you mentioned, the demonstration of production scale, the awareness to the farmers as well, and many more. So I would like to hear from the panelists from their ground experience as well, and from the institutions as well, as we are diverting our agricultural systems with resiliency towards more capacitating farmers and towards more solidarity farming systems. So what could be done to solve or to overcome the challenges which is being faced in the Africa as well, in other countries, to promote the agroecological systems more for the food, not only for the commercial basis. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question. There's a woman there in the aisle.
Hello, I am Alejandra from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and I just wanted to go back to the resilience credit, and I was wondering, like, how do you measure that? How do you measure resilience? What sort of indicators are you using, and how do you take into account risk and like that the different countries, different regions, they face different challenges? So if you can expand on that a little bit more, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, Jahan, I think many questions are addressed to you. I'm going to let you go first and see what you can answer, and then I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to also chime in.
Sorry, Patty, can I just add a quick qualifier to the question as I missed a part of it? I think it was also a call to say that if, because we are in a situation of climate crisis, the private sector won't be able to ensure their profits long term. It's kind of impossible. So for in this situation of crisis, financiers shouldn't be demanding guarantees, these strict guarantees, but they have to do more. So if we can get comments from the panel on that. And my colleague here is from the Jeunes Volontaires from the Ivory Coast. Thanks.
More? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Jahan, you want to start first? And then Dale afterwards.
Yeah, last one first. Resilience credit. This concept has now been officially published. It's part of the Just Financing Guidebook. It has been featured as a new innovative financial instrument. We are establishing a Friends of Resilience Credit Group that will be further designing the concept, the methodology, the pricing mechanism, pilot testing this in few countries, and together with Ministry of International Cooperation of the Egyptian government, our plan is to launch it officially at COP28. We do have measurement tools within IFAD. So for example, we looked into 38 million beneficiaries, and what we have found out that 38 million beneficiaries have improved their resilience by 20%. And there are various indicators for measuring the resilience. Access to market during a period of shock, for example, what you're doing with the income, how you are coping with a particular shock. There are a set of indicators that we use. But you're right, different communities would have different approaches to improve their resilience. So what we are currently thinking is coming up with standardized indicators in form of an index and measuring those. We can have further offline discussion about exactly how we are doing it. The guarantee part, look, guarantee itself is not going to solve the problem. What is important is to bring blended financing instruments. It's a combination of guarantee, with grant mechanism. There are preconditions for providing guarantee. Is the market there? Is the business case sound? Is there a return prospect? But I wouldn't necessarily just think about guarantee from a private sector perspective. It really depends on the context. Guarantee could also be deployed for non-profit making organizations. So it's not just private organizations who are purely driven by that profit motive. But now that there is a movement on ESG, we are seeing that if you're again improving the resilience of our communities, then they align better with the ESG indicators of these private sector entities. So I think stars are aligning. It will take more time. I mean, if you look at climate and environment, it took us 12 years to mainstream climate and environment into government planning and budgeting process. The journey started back in 2008. So if we want to do the same with agroecology, yeah, the direction has been set, but it will take some time for us to arrive at our destination. Thanks.
Dale, did you want to come in?
Very good questions. If I understand the gentleman who asked the question, I think you're from Palestine. I like that question very much because I understood you to ask, how do you get communities to adopt these practices, not necessarily so much for money, but for being motivated to have enough food. Was that your question? And so it's a great question because from what I've learned, obviously I'm not an African. However, I have come to appreciate the culture in Africa by living in a community. And there's a great deal of caring and encouragement and assisting families that are slow learners or reluctant, because a community does better when everybody does better. And so you get a lot of that collaborative cooperation that helps us because it's expensive to do the extension work. So as a company, to be honest, we used to do a lot, but now the community does its own extension. They know how to help each other. So that would be a very interesting dynamic that happens at a certain threshold. Now, the gentleman, my French is not very good. Are you able to? Okay. In fact, it's non-existent. A guarantee is a real issue. And I would beg to disagree a little bit with my colleague over here, because every time I deal with a lender, the first thing they worry about is risk. Are you going to be able to pay us back? And there's some kind of collateral, where there's cash collateral and asset collateral. And there are various ways that if you're buying commodities like we do, and we're trying to turn those commodities into products, they may say, okay, we'll give you money to buy the commodities, but those commodities will belong to us. Because if you default, those commodities will become us, and then we'll dispose of it and get our money back that way. So there are many different ways, and that's what makes it very interesting as a business to learn these things, to see how you can get a better deal. They're trying to get money out of you, and you're trying to get money out of them. So it's a nice contest, but very important point.
I want to clarify something. This is very important. IFAD is a UN agency. We are not here to make profit. Okay, the way we provide guarantee is very different than how others would provide the guarantee. I just want to make that very clear. Thanks.
So I know there are a lot more questions out there, but we do need to close very soon, and hopefully our panelists will stick around for a few minutes if there's time for questions afterwards. But I want to give the closing remarks to Mr. Satya Tripathi, Secretary General of the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet. You've been sitting there in the front row listening to this conversation, so we'd appreciate you reflecting on what you've just heard.
Thank you, Patty. And I'm sorry that I have to stand between you and whatever else you have planned for this evening. Not a very easy thing to do. But I think there are some important issues and some insights that were shared this evening, and I'll try to sum it up as well as I can. I think financing is a big issue. There's a lot of concern that the money that has been promised never gets delivered. And then creative economics comes into play. We promised you 100 billion, but that 100 billion was also private sector, and so everything else is in the mix. So it was not really one set of countries giving money to another set of countries. Now, creative as it is, it doesn't help the cause. We are at a very bad place in terms of not just the climate challenge, but also the food systems, the soil health. And I was speaking at a session with the insurance industry somewhere else in the blue zone, and one of the things that we were discussing was that at 4 degrees Celsius, the whole planet will be uninsurable. So if you can't have insurance, you're not going to have any guarantees, because guarantees is about hedging. And so everybody that hedges something for you goes forward and finds a hedge from someone else. In the insurance industry, that's very standard. It's called reinsurance. Some of the biggest insurance companies whose revenues run into hundreds of billions of dollars are basically intermediaries. They take your risk, give you a price and premium, and then pass it on to somebody else. And then that somebody else gives it to somebody else. And that's how we all are insured, whether this building or any crop or any market or anything else. So what is the solution? We can keep talking about who should pay whom to blame, and that's a realistic conversation in terms of equity and climate justice that must be had. But that's not going to solve our problem. What is going to solve our problem is to look within. I'll give you an example. We have been strongly engaged in a natural farming program in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Our partners, the government of Andhra Pradesh, it's led by the government of Andhra Pradesh, but more importantly, credit goes to the women farmers that actually break their back in the hot sun, doing what they do to actually present a world-class example to all of us of what resilience means, what hard work can actually produce. And while we fulminate over the meaning of risk and what is possible and what is impossible, how much risk should we take, these people whose resilience is this little, because they live between crop cycles. If they don't make enough money in a crop cycle, their children do not eat. And they actually are willing to change, and we don't. So let me tell you what happens when people are willing to change. So they were at 40,000 farmers when I first had the privilege of meeting Mr. Vijay Kumar, who was the pioneer of this program, and his women farmers that are in the millions now. So between then and now, they've gotten to 1 million farmers. Very substantive research, including by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, the World Agroforestry Center, and everybody tells us that it is resilient, it conserves water, it reduces use of electricity, because that's what you use to pump out water, and it uses no fertilizers or pesticides. Input costs drop by anywhere between 50 to 80%, depending on the crop, and yields have increased anywhere between 30 to 200%, depending again on the crop and the agroclimatic zone. And last year, the German Development Bank, KfW, came forward and gave them 300 million euros at 0.5% interest. So that's what happens when we do what we need to do. The world will come to us and help us achieve our goals. Now, is that enough? Not really, but it's a great start. Now, why is KfW able to give you at 0.5%? Are they doing you a favor? Absolutely not. It's good business for them. Should we be grateful to them? Absolutely. Why? Because there is money much below 0.5%. So for them to lend at 0.5, they're still making money. But they're also assuming the risk, which is why we should be grateful to them, because they're setting a global benchmark that when you take the risk for farmers that are really willing to stick their neck out and do what is right for people and planet, we should stand with them. That's the first point I wanted to make as an essence of what is, because I heard a lot of discussion about finance and guarantees and all. The second thing is this. that carbon markets can actually play a beneficial part, not by stealing from the farmers and giving them $4 per ton of carbon, which we have seen. Shameful, indeed. It will work if we really quantify not carbon as in science. That's the same measure, whether it is emissions mitigation, whether it is coming from reduction credits in farming or sequestration credits. What needs to happen is to recognize that while the scientific measure of a ton of carbon remains the same, what it does is very different from one carbon to another. We need to reward better carbon. And how do you do that? By recognizing the fact that when farmers do that and sequester 2 tons of carbon per acre or 5 tons per hectare, what they're doing is actually they're conserving water by doing that. They're reducing electricity use. Every watt of electricity not used is a watt of electricity produced. By not using fertilizers, that's fossil fuel based. You're creating another opportunity to get rid of fossil fuels. Because every time people talk about fossil fuels, somebody raises their hand and say, oh, you're going to starve yourself to death because fertilizers come from it. That needs to go. Just about 90 years ago, before NPK started becoming mainstream, we actually fed ourselves without these fertilizers, nitrates, phosphates, and phosphorus. So we can do that now. And we've seen that at a 1 million farmer scale, more than 1 million hectares. And when you talk about money, India alone annually spends $30 billion in fertilizer subsidies. I'm not even talking about the farm electricity subsidies, which is another 18 billion, interest subvention schemes, farm loan waivers. If you add all of that, that's $70 billion just for India. And what we have seen is that it is $200 per farmer to switch, just $200. So the entire 120 million smallholders in India, you can actually switch with $24 billion over a period of 8 to 10 years. It can't happen overnight. So it is eminently possible to find resources if we repurpose government expenditure wisely. Once we do that, we will actually find the guarantees as well. There are enough guarantee providers in the market, but we have to stand up for ourselves and do what is right. That is the only way this is going to work. Pointing fingers and blaming others is not the solution to what is a humongous existential challenge for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Satya, for ending us on a very positive note. I want to thank all of you for sticking with us. It's been a long day, and I want you to please join me in thanking the panelists. I wish you all a good evening.